These lectures are not designed for use as medical references to diagnose, treat, or prevent medical or mental health illnesses or trauma. If you have questions about the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of a medical condition or mental illness, you should consult your personal physician or other mental health professional.
Carolyn Casey was an awkward girl. She was clumsy and tended to run into things, but she had courage and lots of energy. Her dream was to be Mowgli from the Jungle Book. When she was 17, she went to the eye doctor with her little sister, playing the role of a supportive big sister, but she got her own eye exam too. When she exuberantly told the optometrist she hoped to get a driving lesson soon, there was cold silence. He then looked at her parents and said, "You haven't told her?" See, Caroline had always been legally blind. Anything more than 2 feet away was a total blur, but to her, it was totally normal. In fact, even after learning about her impairment, she refused to let it hold her back. She became an archaeologist. She managed a restaurant. She became a masseuse. She graduated from business school and eventually became a global consultant, but never mentioned to anyone or to HR that she had a visual impairment. On the outside, she looked great. But on the inside, she was terrified all the time. She was struggling. She felt like an imposter. At age 28, she finally went to HR, and they sent her to an eye doctor who simply asked her, "Why are you trying so hard not to be yourself?" She was furious, but the seed was planted. She eventually quit her job and followed her dream. She learned how to be an elephant handler, and she became Mowgli from the Jungle Book. This legally blind woman then rode an elephant across India. She learned the power of belief and the power of self-acceptance. She now runs a nonprofit called Kanchi, named after her elephant. Kanchi works to change mindsets about disability and promote self-acceptance. Welcome to our lecture on advanced cognitive techniques, where we'll continue examining the power of beliefs and the necessity of self-acceptance. Now that you've learned to capture cognitive content, the automatic thoughts, and have some idea of when you're making an assumption, let's turn to what we can do about it. Let's first go back to the idea of cognitive processes, how we use content to draw conclusions or make decisions. We introduced the idea of habits of mind in our last lecture, the shortcuts we take to save time and energy. They are common, they're often helpful, but sometimes they get us in trouble. We need to be familiar with our habits so that we can be on guard when they are in use. Let's go over the full list of habits of mind. First, we have mind reading, or imagining we know what another person is thinking. Fortune telling, where we try to predict the future. Catastrophizing, where we immediately jump to the worst case scenario and then inflate the potential negative consequences. Labeling, where we affix labels to people instead of talking about situations or events or occurrences. Discounting the positive, selectively attending to things that are negative, overgeneralizing, dichotomous or all or none thinking, putting shoulds on ourselves or unrealistic expectations, over-personalizing, or emotional reasoning, where we assume that if we have a strong feeling, a strong emotion, then the thought must be true, when really those two are quite different. There are, of course, other kinds of shortcuts, but these tend to be the most common. It's a helpful exercise to do some self-monitoring of your cognitions, one of our basic skills, and see if you can identify any of these habits of mind. The habits I used to fall back on a lot, especially as a younger person, were discounting the positive, over-personalization, and mind reading. But of course, all of them were at play at one time or another. Remember that you want to be able to identify the type of habit because it will help you with our next tool, the CBT thought record, really the workhorse of cognitive therapy, so we're going to be spending a good deal of time on it. So what is a thought record? It's a tool to do something called cognitive restructuring, where we rebuild, rewrite, or restructure our thoughts. In order for those new thoughts to be convincing and effective, we have to go through a structured, balanced process. And let me say that you may conclude that your thoughts are spot on, and then you need to cope with a very real problem in a very different way. But the thought record starts with simple self-monitoring, one of our basic skills. And here you'll be capturing a trigger, an emotion, and then the automatic thoughts, or our surface level thoughts. As you'll see, all of these are linked together, so once you have one of them, it's easier to get to the others. There are different versions of thought records, but I'd like to show you the 7-column version. You can just Google CBT thought record or CBT 7-column thought record, and you'll see plenty of forms that you can print out. You can also just take a blank sheet of paper in landscape orientation and make 7 columns. The first left-hand column is for the trigger or the activating event. The second column is for the emotion, and here you'll write down the emotion, but you'll also be rating the intensity on a 1 to 100 scale for that emotion. Column 3 is for the automatic thoughts, and usually there's more than one, so we circle the one that has the most emotional charge to it. Columns 4 and 5 are evidence for, evidence against. Column 6 is for the new balanced thought, and column 7 is for you to re-rate the emotional intensity. Now that you know the 7 columns, let's go back and show how these work. Let's watch a clip of David as he works on the first 3 columns. What we will do is we'll do something called a thought record, and I'll just show you basically what that looks like. So on the left-hand column, we have a trigger, and that's like, we just use pain, abdominal pain as a trigger. It could be you get a phone call, it could be you watch something on TV that reminded you of something, or it could be just about anything that happens, and it's just the situation, just the specifics, no interpretation at all. So we have the trigger, and then we want you to pay attention to the emotion. We've talked about sadness, happiness, anxiety, any of those emotions, frustration, guilt, they all sort of fit there. We'll have you rate the intensity of them from 0 to 100, and then to try to capture those automatic thoughts. And first, we're not going to wrestle with them too much. We just want you to develop the capacity and the skill of catching those thoughts. And sometimes they're so fleeting and they're so quick, they're hard to grab hold of, so it takes a little bit of practice to write them down, slow down your mind, and figure out what those thoughts are. So let me pause there and see what questions you have about starting a thought record. Let's go over a few tips to help you with your first thought record. The first challenge is to figure out when to do a thought record. If you're first learning, I would recommend picking an event that has a mild to medium emotional charge. You don't want to start with something that's too intense or too overwhelming. It's the emotion that often serves as a clue that it might be a good time to do a thought record. So pick your event and start on the first 3 columns. When writing down the trigger, the trick is to keep it neutral. Don't allow interpretations or emotions to creep in. For example, if you were driving and someone was really laying into their horn and irritated you, the trigger would be, I was driving and someone honked their horn. It wouldn't be, I was driving and some impatient jerk just couldn't wait their turn. Next, you want to name each emotion you are feeling and rate the intensity of each emotion from 0 to 100. You can build an emotional thesaurus of different emotion words if necessary, and don't laugh, this is actually needed a lot more than you might think. Now, many folks struggle a little more with the automatic thought portion, but there are a few tips that might help. You can ask yourself, what was going through my mind right at that moment or just prior to that moment? What images or memories came up? What meaning did I give to it? You might also use something called the downward arrow technique, where you dig for thoughts underneath thoughts. In the honking car example, you might capture an automatic thought like, I can't let that creep get away with this. Using the downward arrow, I would then ask you, what if you did let him get away with it? Well, I'd be telling him he was right and that I deserved it. And if you did that, then what? Well, it would prove I'm a pushover, that I'm abused, and that I don't deserve to be respected. Let's look at another example of how those first 3 columns can be completed by turning to our case of Amanda. So Amanda, I believe you were going to get started on a thought record, and we were just going to do the first 3 columns and see what came up. You're going to pick an event that had an emotional charge, write down the event, the trigger, write down the emotions, and then if there were any automatic thoughts that you're able to capture. Were you able to do that?
Yeah, I'm sorry I folded it. I normally don't do that.
All good, right? And thank you for doing it, thank you for bringing it. So do you want to walk me through it?
Yeah, okay, I can do that. So the first one is describe the situation. So the situation I was in was I was sitting at my desk and I was working on job applications.
Got it. Got it.
And so the next one is to identify my rate, my rate, well, rate my mood.
Okay.
And I was really, really down on myself. I felt really frustrated and depressed, irritated. I was looking online for jobs that I could apply to and really wasn't coming up with anything that was really speaking to me.
Yeah.
So I was getting a little bit frustrated with that. And then the thoughts of just feeling like, why am I even bothering to do this? I mean, I'm not good enough. Nobody's going to want to hire me anyway. So I guess that kind of falls into the next one, the automatic thoughts. That's kind of where my mind went, was just, I'm not good enough. My resume isn't perfect. My job experience isn't perfect. Just why am I even bothering? If it's not going to be perfect, then why bother?
Right. And did you end up applying for jobs that day or not yet?
No, I just really felt overwhelmed by the feelings of just not being good enough, not feeling qualified, not feeling like, I was even worthy of the opportunity to even go in and interview for the job, let alone actually get the job.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really rich example, and there's a lot of important stuff to work with. If we can rewind just a little bit, and the thought record is one of those core skills, and it just takes a lot of practice to become comfortable with it. On the left-hand column, that's where you write about the trigger or the event, and you did it exactly the way it's recommended, where you briefly, very succinctly describe just the context. So there's no interpretation, there's no shadowing, there's no emotional words, there's no judgment words, there's no guessing about what other people are thinking or any of that. It's just sitting at my desk, working on some job applications. So that's just the facts, just the trigger. So that was perfect. And as you do future thought records, you want to make sure that in that column you keep out all of the emotion stuff and interpretations, and it's just the situation. The second column is really about first identifying the emotions that you're feeling, and oftentimes there's more than one because we're complicated, right? And there's lots of layers of things that we're feeling. You're then supposed to rate the intensity of each of those emotions from 0 to 100. That gives us a number that we can then use to reassess later to see if after the exercise those emotions have gotten more intense, they've gotten less intense, or maybe they've stayed the same. So I did here in that column, you do something that a lot of people do. They have the emotions, but since cognitions are so closely linked to emotions, the cognitions start creeping in too. So it's, what we want to do in the thought records is we slow things down and we carefully pull them apart so that we can better analyze them and look at them. So in that category, what were the emotions? I see there's several you have down there.
Yeah, so I have that I felt down and depressed, frustrated, and irritated.
Okay. And what were the intensities, that 0 to 100 number on those?
I would say that 90.
90, okay.
90. They
okay.
were pretty intense.
Yeah, all right. And then the next column is the automatic thoughts. So that's tuning in to sort of that internal talk or chatter or images or whatever's going through your mind. Usually each of those thoughts or each of those emotions will have a thought or even a family of thoughts attached to it. And I see several thoughts that you've written down, and you shared several sort of just off the top of your head. So what were the thoughts you captured there?
So I was thinking, why do I even bother to fill out these applications?
Yeah.
In my head, I'm thinking I'm never going to find a job. It's just not going to work out for me. That as I'm filling out the applications or even just writing the cover letter, that I can't get it perfect.
Yeah.
And because it's not perfect, I'm not going to get a job. So why do I bother? Those were the thoughts that were, just really overwhelming. Just the fact that, my experience level is not perfect. I didn't have, I had good grades, but I didn't have perfect grades. I wasn't, completely straight A's across the board. I just didn't feel like it mattered because it's not good enough.
Okay, okay. And those are a lot of important and powerful thoughts. And the first few that you shared, why do I bother? I'm never going to get a job. They have a real hopeless feeling to them. So it's not surprising that you felt down and depressed, because it's things are bad and they're not going to get better. Mm-hmm. Sort of that hopeless feeling. The last ones you shared are important. They're related, but they're different. And you said the word perfect several times. And I'm wondering if that's a theme for you. So would you say that you're a perfectionist, or you need things to be perfect, or you don't feel comfortable?
Yeah, very much so. I feel like if everything is not perfectly in its place, then it's all out of order, and I can't make sense of it.
Right.
That if it's not just so, I can't wrap my brain around it. And so because I can't wrap my brain around it, I just can't move past it.
Right.
I feel like I have to go back and make it just right before I can move on.
So it sounds like you feel, when things aren't perfect, you feel discomfort and you feel compelled to fix it or to do something different. Let's break down this skill, really a set of many micro skills for our toolbox. First, we have to capture an AT, and an automatic thought, and its related emotions and emotional intensity. Ideally, this is all linked to a trigger too. So we have the trigger, we have the automatic thought, we have an emotion. Before moving to the next stage, something called cognitive restructuring, make sure you've captured all the relevant and emotionally charged automatic thoughts that were triggered. They might all be related, but there might be some linked to entirely different emotions. You can be proud of someone, but envious at the same time. You can feel disappointed, but also determined at the same time. Once you've done that, it's time to prepare to do some cognitive restructuring. This is the part where you roll up your sleeves, wrestle with your thoughts, and try to come up with something that is more fair and more helpful. Since there may be many automatic thoughts in play at the same time, you need to pick just one, what's often called the hot thought. Hot because it's usually associated with the highest intensity negative feeling. As you're learning this, though, you might want to start with a less hot thought that will be easier to challenge. It's really up to you, but you eventually want to get to that hottest thought. Once you've identified a negative automatic thought, you circled the automatic thought that you're going to address, then you want to move to look at the evidence for and against and other restructuring techniques. Amanda, she's not at the rewriting stage just yet, column 6 of 7, but let's look ahead at some of the strategies that we might try, and we'll go through each of these in detail. There's looking at evidence for or against. There's identifying the habit of mind, the name it to tame it. There is a technique called decentering, where we step outside of ourselves. Linguistic strategies and behavioral experiments. Let's go through each of those. First is looking for evidence for and against that particular automatic thought. What are the facts, and what are the opinions, assumptions, or guesses? Can you find any counterexamples from the past or the present, or by looking at the lives of other people? What would an investigative team find? Here you put yourself in the shoes of Sherlock Holmes, or imagine you're in an episode of CSI. Strategy 2, this was identifying the habit of mind, the name it to tame it. If you find yourself jumping to conclusions, look for an alternate explanation. If you're selectively attending, what's on the other side of the coin? The third strategy is decentering. And here's where you step outside of yourself and think, what would I tell my best friend or my loved one if she had a similar thought? You then say that same supportive statement to yourself. The fourth strategy was linguistic strategies. Here we look at language and try to soften the edges just to be more fair. Are you using absolute words like always or never? You might also try using something like yes, but, where, yes, you acknowledge the truthful parts of that automatic thought, but you list the other side of the coin, or the things which maybe aren't quite so fair. And if you're totally stuck, you can run it by a loved one or a friend, or you can do our last strategy, a behavioral experiment. Now, if you had the belief, I'm socially invisible, even if I try, no one wants to interact with me, how would you set up a behavioral experiment to test that idea out? Let's see how Amanda started using these strategies in this next clip.
There's always that comparison between me and this other candidate, and that other candidate is always going to be more favorable than me.
Okay, and there's a lot that's there, and let's sort of maybe systematically work through them. If we're looking for habits of mind that might be driving beliefs about perfectionism, you've mentioned a few, and one is to attend to particular attributes of other candidates and to attend to particular attributes of yourself. And it sounds like you, the selective attention is to highlight the positive traits of these other candidates, and then to selectively highlight the negative traits that you might have, or the traits that the employer doesn't like or won't value. So one thing that we can do is to make sure that we're doing a fair comparison, that we are equally attending to both positive and negative attributes of other applicants as well as yourself. When you're feeling down or depressed, negative things loom large. And when you're feeling confident and happy, positive things loom large. We're looking for that wise mind, that middle ground, where we're able to see positive and negative, to realize that not everyone is perfect for the job, but every candidate does bring strengths, and maybe they have some weaknesses too, and we should carefully look at them and balance them. So selective attention is one possibility. All or none thinking is also a possibility with perfectionism. So either it's all completely perfect or it's worthless. Okay. And most things in the world aren't all or none. There's a lot of shades of gray in between. So if you look at someone's resume, say you're an employer, some of them will be absolutely tucked and neat and really look good. Others, not so much. But most of them are going to be, somewhere in the middle. And your job as an applicant is to do the best job that you can do, even if it's not a perfect job. So it's not all perfect or all terrible. It's somewhere in between. Maybe it's 90%, maybe it's 95%, but not 100%. So that's the first way to challenge is to think about what kinds of cognitive distortions or what kinds of habits of mind am I using. Another way, and the one that's written on the particular sheet that you have, is to look for evidence for and against. So life experiences from you, from other people, that tell you, yes, it has to be perfect or it's not going to work, or maybe they tell you the opposite. So let's say from your life, you applied to college, you got in, you graduated. Was your college application perfect?
Probably in hindsight, no, but it was as perfect as I could make it at the time. Okay.
So maybe at the time you thought it was perfect and you were able to go ahead and apply. In hindsight, it wasn't perfect, and you have more perspective and have learned and grown a lot. But you still got in. So we could think of that as evidence against this idea that an application has to be perfect or it's not going to be successful.
So you can see her working her way through our list of strategies. In the early stages, I will encourage her to use multiple strategies, partly so she can learn them all, but so she can figure out also which one works best for her. Try a few thought records on your own and try all of the strategies out. What worked? Let's listen in to Amanda again.
So we've talked about a couple of ways to challenge thoughts, looking at the particular or possible cognitive distortion, looking at evidence for and against. And another strategy that some people will use, because it's hard when you're in it and the thoughts are in your head to think of a way to rewrite it that's believable. But if you had a best friend that said this to you, or she's looking for a job and she's like, I just can't apply, I'm not going to get it, I'm not good enough, my applications aren't perfect, what would you say to her?
You got this, girl. You got this. Do it. You got this.
Yeah. So some cheerleading, right? So hey, man, you got it. And why should she believe you? Like, how could you make that more believable?
Probably because, this is coming from someone other than her who can kind of see her at a distance, as opposed to her seeing herself so close up, that someone who has a little bit of a distance from that individual can kind of see it differently.
Yeah. So do you have that kind of person in your life? Is there someone that can be like, you got this, girl, go for it, go for it?
Yeah, I got a couple of people who I think could be a cheerleader for me.
Yeah, and I think turning to those social supports who can also, not just cheerlead, but give you some perspective can be really helpful. Let's think about other things that you might say to her. Again, we're going for balance, sort of that middle road that appreciates and recognizes reality, but at the same time maybe has a thicker vein of optimism in it. So what else could you say?
Maybe something like, yeah, your, work experience isn't perfect. They may want you to have, 3 years of experience, before coming into this position. And you may not have that, but, you're smart, you're a quick learner, you acclimate to new situations well, you can figure out a way to circumvent the fact that you don't have this immediate work experience, but then you can also draw on the experiences that you do have. You may not necessarily have those 3 required years within that particular job or that particular industry, but, you can go back to things that you did when you were in school that are similar, maybe not exactly the same, but similar experiences that you can draw upon and say, well, I may not have this, but when I was in school, I did this.
Right. So I'm hearing a yes, but. So yes, acknowledging the reality of the situation, but, and looking at the other side of the coin. And I'm hearing a pushback against selective attention. And with the perfectionism, you were selectively attending to the negative things, to the deficiencies in your application. And there was no discussion about sort of the strengths that you bring to the table. And your friend, right? Your friend is like, hey, yeah, you're missing a few things here, but look at all the stuff that you bring. And again, it's not just cheerleading, because it should be the actual strengths that you do bring. And realizing that every candidate has some deficiencies, every candidate has some strengths, and it's about how you package it. And the job search is kind of artificial, right? And people present themselves in a certain way or frame things in a certain way. And really the goal is to get your foot in the door and get an interview, and then you interview them as much as they are interviewing you, because it's about chemistry and goodness of fit, knowing they're not a perfect employer, you're not a perfect employee, and maybe that's okay.
The final step, column 7, is to re-rate the intensity of the emotion. Did it go down? If not, explore and learn why. Did you pick the right automatic thought? Was the new thought that you wrote believable? Is this an unchangeable fact where you should work on acceptance? It's all grist for the mill. There's no doubt that thought records can be clunky and time-consuming, but putting in the time and practice will help you get faster and to eventually internalize the new thoughts. I wanted to share a few strategies that viewers from the first CBT course have shared. One learner started a compilation of new balanced thoughts and just kept this as a running list on his phone. Whenever he had a minute, he'd take out his phone and he'd scroll through the list. Eventually, the new thoughts became quite familiar and were easier to pull up in his head during the moment. Another learner wrote common automatic thoughts down on a slip of paper and put them in her thoughts jar. When she had the time, she'd pull out the automatic thought and rework a thought record until she got to a balanced thought. She'd do this over and over until she didn't need to do a thought record anymore. What both of these folks were doing is something called cognitive rehearsal, where you practice, first on paper, then in your head. You replay those automatic thoughts many, many times, so why not put on a new record and listen to some new music? So let's do a quick recap of what we've added to our toolbox. We're still in the cognitive category, and we built the more complex skill of thought records for cognitive restructuring on top of our basic skills for self-monitoring. It includes the micro skills of emotional awareness, of capturing automatic thoughts, identifying habits of mind, and various strategies to help us arrive at a balanced thought. We'll come back to this tool many times, but I encourage you to also practice on your own. In our next lecture, we'll look at tools to address worry and rumination, or what to do when we simply think too much. Thank you.